important for us to hear it. So before we talk about it, let's play that clip again.
That prompted a torrent of racial epithets. One woman in a pink MAGA shirt yelled, "You hear that, guys? This nigger voted for Joe Biden." Then the crowd, perhaps around 20 people, joined in screaming, "Boo, fucking nigger." No one had ever called me a nigger while wearing the uniform of a Capitol Police officer. In the days following the attempted insurrection, other Black officers shared with me their own stories of racial abuse on January 6th. One officer told me he had never, in his entire 40 years of life, been called a nigger to his face, and that streak ended on January 6th.
Difficult to hear from a Capitol Police officer, and yet we have been hearing accounts like that throughout, first anonymously and then on the record from Capitol Police officers and Metropolitan Police officers. Let's talk about it. Former DC Police and Philadelphia Police Commissioner Ramsey, what was your reaction to hearing that?
Well, this entire episode is something that clearly is leaving some pretty deep psychological wounds. I mean, all these officers, the one common thread that you could see, aside from just the heroics and so forth, is just how deeply this affected them. Mm-hmm. I just hope that they're going to get the kind of support and help that they're going to really need to be able to recover from it. Because one officer, and I believe it was Don that mentioned he was going to EAP. Well, EAP is Employee Assistance Program. They aren't really designed to deal with the kind of trauma that we're talking about here. So I hope they reach out and get some professional help, because it's going to be a long time, if ever, that they're going to be able to really move on.
May I ask you a question, because you are a Black former police officer? Were you surprised by that testimony? How did it affect you as a former law enforcement officer who's a Black man?
I wasn't surprised when I watched the video, because with everything else going on in that video, I'm not surprised that ethnic slurs would be used. I mean, it's a shame to say it, but I wasn't surprised. I have not experienced that in uniform, and I spent 47 years in uniform and haven't had that happen where someone called me that to my face.
Yeah.
Maybe behind my back, but certainly not to my face. And I understand just how deeply. Here's a man who's fighting. All those officers are fighting just as hard as all the other officers to try to protect the people in the Capitol, and then to be called, that word. I mean, yeah.
Laura, you're a former federal prosecutor. What was your reaction?
Well, I could not help. First of all, I have a daily radio show. I've been called the N-word on air before, talking about politics. Nothing to do with race. The idea of it being a knee-jerk reaction for so many people, while that might be shocking to some, it remains hurtful, but it's never quite surprising with the notion of race being just below the surface in America. I will say I couldn't help but remember and think about and be reminiscent of the notion of what it was like for Black soldiers coming back from World War II to confront racism in uniform. Some were lynched coming off the street for the audacity to wear a uniform, top of mind in America. I thought it was so poignant, the idea of even the conversation surrounding Officer Gunnell, the idea of the assumption that because of his brown skin, he was automatically not even American. They don't know that he was a naturalized citizen. They don't know his heritage.
Or that he was a veteran.
Or that he was a veteran.
Yeah.
But the assumption was that he was an other, that he was not truly American. And I want to put some context in it. What Officer Dunn was responding to was the big lie when he made the statement to say something political about who he voted for, because someone was saying no one voted for Biden and that everyone voted for Trump and they were coming to stop the steal. And his reaction was to go outside of his normal apolitical self as an officer and say, well, I voted for Biden, am I nobody? And the reaction, the knee jerk, was to attack, to vilify, to be vicious about this. And that's why I hear you talk about this. That's why I found the comments from Congressman Adam Kinzinger so poignant as well, to address the idea of just the way that that race in America and the confluence of politics was used as an excuse by some not to want to have even the bipartisan commission, because there was not an investigation into the reaction to the killing, the murder of George Floyd last summer. And his statement from the National Guard saying, I was called up from the National Guard. And not once did I think the reaction to what I was seeing there was a threat to democracy. But this was. And that, just the whole culmination of all that, Jake, it made my heart just drop and sink and rise and fall, because you're seeing that none of this can be compartmentalized. Not one of these aspects of it. And I just will end with saying what Officer Dunn said. I guess this is America, too.
Yeah, and let me bring in Terry Gaynor, former Capitol Police Chief. One of the things that was also disturbing, if we could get clip 14 ready, is that Daniel Hodges, who was one of the Metropolitan DC police officers who testified today, who's white, he was treated differently by the crowd. And I'd like to run clip 14 if we have that ready.
They didn't say anything especially xenophobic to me, but to my black colleagues and anyone who's not white. And some of them would try to recruit me. One of them came up to me and said, "Are you my brother?" There are many known organizations with ties to white supremacy who had a presence there. Like 3%ers, Oath Keepers, that kind of thing. People who associate with Donald Trump are find more likely to subscribe to that kind of belief system.
Chief Gaynor, what was your reaction? I mean, that's a pretty jarring disparity there. You have these terrorists, these insurrectionists, hurling racist epithets at the two officers of color who testified today, and yet to one of the white officers, they were trying to, in his view, recruit him.
Yeah, I think it demonstrates the sickness of so many of the people who were in that crowd, that they think they can divide any of us by either how we dress or whom we live with or what color of our skin. And I think that goes right to the point that several of the officers made about what does America look like. I don't think it should look like that. I don't want it to look like that, but is that where we've come to? So I think that was a powerful part of the statements that was coming out of all these officers. And knowing Officer Dunn like I do, and you all know how the dome looks, for him to describe going up into that dome at the end of this fight, at the end of the day, and sit there with some fellow officers, some of whom were African American, and shed a tear. Big, strong Officer Dunn was broken to tears over how he and others were being treated in that Capitol dome, the dome where President Kennedy laid or President Lincoln laid, and how important it is to those officers, both Capitol Police officers and the DC officers. I think this was one of the most powerful testimonies I've heard in my years being the Sergeant of Arms and the Chief of the Capitol Police. I am so proud of these officers, and boy, have they laid the gauntlet for the members of Congress to do what they're supposed to do. They know what their duty is, and by golly, they ought to start doing it.
Well, and let me ask you on that note, we've heard a lot about backing the blue, especially last year when there were the Black Lives Matter protests and the George Floyd protests, when there was violence and vandalism and riots in cities during some of those protests. We hear a lot about it when progressives were talking about defunding the police. What does backing the blue look like for members of Congress starting today? What, in your view, as a former chief of the Capitol Police, what would a congressman who truly backs the blue be doing today?
Well, they would join with the other members of this particular committee and speak up and speak out. And even if they could maybe separate for a minute the President Trump issue, which has to be addressed, but concentrate on all the other issues that were raised by these officers' testimony and what's going on before that. The other members of Congress who have been repeatedly doubting this and doing the things that were talked about today, whether it was out in the Capitol grounds today or over at the Justice Department, they ought to listen to what their fellow members said and listen to the challenge of those officers and do better. You know, and there's one other thing. There is an old saying, if you can't stand behind us, maybe the next time this happens, you ought to get in front of us. And I think some of them ought to think about that.
Well, and we heard today, John King, we heard Officer Dunn talk about, he quoted at length House Republican leader Kevin McCarthy in McCarthy's perhaps only brave moment of the last year, if not longer, when he went on the floor of the House and condemned President Trump for his role in the insurrection and the violence, and talked about what a shameful episode it was. And since then, McCarthy has been singing a completely different tune. But we heard Harry Dunn talking about it and talking about how then, today, and tomorrow, I will be defending and protecting Kevin McCarthy. Let's play that clip if we can. We have old McCarthy, old Kevin McCarthy. Well, never mind, I misunderstood. But in any case, how does Kevin McCarthy answer the questions prompted today about his behavior, given the fact that he's been doing everything he could, literally everything he could, to sandbag this commission or sandbag any investigation?
He comes up with nonsensical, non-reality, non-earth-based answers. I don't know other way to put it, to say this is a Pelosi partisan committee. No, it is not. And for any Republicans watching at home, do the homework yourself. Don't trust us on television. They had a chance for a nonpartisan, even committee. They blocked it. They fought it in the House and they lost, and then they blocked it in the Senate. They could have had a committee with a nonpartisan investigation into this day. So now he wants to make it all about Nancy Pelosi. Why? He changed his tune. So let's ask, why did he change his tune? Because Donald Trump got mad at him, and it was made clear to him, you're 6-8 votes away from being the next Speaker of the House, and he believes his only path to being Speaker is to hitch his wagon to Donald J. Trump. Donald Trump doesn't like it. That is what Kevin McCarthy does now. There's no other way around it. He won't call his own people into line, so he criticizes Kinzinger and Cheney for wanting to pursue the truth, but he doesn't block Marjorie Taylor Greene and Louis Gohmert and Matt Gaetz from running to the Justice Department to saying, free the prisoners?
Yeah.
Free the prisoners. Everybody watched the video of what happened that day. Today, I think, again, if you had any doubts about is this investigation necessary, the officers, I think, made crystal clear why. Number two, to the point that you were just talking about with Chief Gaynor, forgive me, that and with the Chief and Laura, that anger is still out there. That rage is still out there. The people who, whether it was the racism, whether it was the violence, whether it was the attacking an institution, that is still out there, and it's still being fed by lies. From Donald J. Trump to this day, statements in the last 24 hours, and by Republicans in leadership in the House who will not say, no more. We're breaking from this. We will not take his money. We will not take his support. We do not want his endorsement. There's a way out for them. They just won't take it because they believe it will cost them power.
Yeah, and I have to say, Congressman Kinzinger's wife is pregnant, and that baby is someday going to read about her dad today, going to watch videos of her dad today, and we'll see how it stands the test of time. I tend to think that Congressman Kinzinger's on the right side. I tend to not like violent attempts to insurrect the nation. But let us run a clip of Congressman Kinzinger. This is clip number 13, if we can. This is one of the two Republicans on this House Select Committee. He is being threatened by his fellow Republicans who want him stripped of all other committee assignments. Kevin McCarthy is calling him a Pelosi Republican, and as along with Liz Cheney, because they are trying to get to the bottom of what happened on January 6th. And here is a brief excerpt of his testimony today.
I never expected a day to be quite as emotional for me as it has been. You guys may, individually feel a little broken. You guys all talk about the effects you have to deal with, and, you talk about the impact of that day. But you guys won. You guys held. Democracies are not defined by our bad days. We're defined by how we come back from bad days.
We're defined by how we come back from bad days, and you almost heard him stumble there, and it almost sounded like he was going to say Baghdad. He is a veteran, we should note, with the Air Force. A difficult time for him.
Absolutely. His testimony was so powerful today. He went on to say, serving on this committee, I'm here to investigate January 6th, not in spite of my membership in the Republican Party, but because of it. Not to win a political fight, but to learn the facts and defend our democracy. I just want to go back to Officer Dunn and Kevin McCarthy for a minute. I've had the privilege to get to know Harry Dunn over the last couple of months, and I spoke to him last night about how he was preparing his testimony and what he wanted to talk about. And those words of Kevin McCarthy that he put in there, and that he will still protect him today, were critical to the message he wanted to send. I'm a police officer, I'm here to protect you, but I want everybody to listen to what you said on January 7th, in contrast to what you're doing today. And one other thing we mentioned before, in the last question, where the chairman asked Harry Dunn, what do you want to come from this? And he told the story about a hitman goes to jail. But not only does the hitman go to jail, the person who hires them does.
Yeah, let's run that clip.
Okay.
I use an analogy to describe what I want as a hitman. If a hitman is hired and he kills somebody, the hitman goes to jail. But not only does the hitman go to jail, but the person who hired them does. There was an attack carried out on January 6th, and a hitman sent them. I want you to get to the bottom of that.
So to me, there's no question. That is the statement of the day. And that is what I've been hearing from the officers who testified today, members of the committee. I spoke to Liz Cheney. Today was only the beginning. They want to know everything about what happened in the weeks and months leading up. And they want those phone calls and the conversations and the testimony that happened between President Trump, his chief of staff, Mark Meadows, Kevin McCarthy, and if it goes to Republican members, that's what they want to get at.
Yeah, and we should be clear about this, and let me bring in the law enforcement team over here. There's a lot we do not know. 9,000 people, there were more than 9,000 on the ellipse, but I'm just talking about the ones who were violent. Thousands of people, not from DC largely, showed up here. Then to President Trump, then outgoing President Trump, had been talking for weeks, if not months, about January 6th, calling people to come, January 6th. Some of the people who showed up in the Capitol that day, I have no doubt, it was spontaneous, they were swept up in the emotion of the moment, no question. But not the dude who built the gallows, not the guys who had shirts on that said January 6th. I mean, there was planning and there was coordination. Buses were rented. I mean, people knew. I don't know who and I don't know what they knew, but people knew. As a police officer, where do you start?
Well, you got to start with, you start with January 6th, but you got to start working your way backwards. Like you would in any investigation, we're looking at an historical event, and you've got to see what led up to that event. We don't know if it goes back a week, a month, 2 months, 3 months. We don't know the answer to that yet, but there's a trail. There's no question there's a trail. You just have to find it.
There was a meeting at the White House where it was Donald Trump, Mike Flynn, the former National Security Advisor, who has since become apparently some adherent of a QAnon cult, and who also was talking quite publicly about declaring some sort of martial law of the National Guard going in and having another election in states that went for Biden, where the lies were taking hold. And I don't know what happened in that meeting. As a former prosecutor, if you were given subpoena power, if you were put on this committee, what would you want to know? What would you look at?
Well, I'd be thrilled to know that there's no executive privilege for my justice employees, including Jeffrey Rosen and the likes, who can now tell me what was known. Why was there the ability to have some elements of reinforcement or some foresight? What was the chatter going on? Who knew what, when, and why was nothing done about it? That's why I
Just
said.
to explain what you just said, the Attorney General today said
Yes.
that they were waiving executive privilege declarations for anybody who was at the Justice Department during that time, which we all interpret to be Jeffrey Rosen, the then acting Attorney General, wanting to testify.
Absolutely. I'm glad that you clarified that, because that's so important to know about how you can actually achieve transparency. You know, transparency has so many hurdles in front of it. In order to get to the truth, there are sometimes insurmountable hurdles, including things like privilege that says, I don't care what you want to know, I don't have to tell you anything. Then there's times you can actually get to the foundational aspects of it. And so I want to follow that trail and that thread. It could lead to quite an unraveling, or it could lead to a dead end. But that's why this is really the middle of the story. As provocative, as heart-wrenching as all this has been, this is not even us at the tip of the iceberg. We are seeing it from a distance.
Yeah.
So how did we get there? And as you said, you don't all of a sudden gather the materials for gallows on the mall in front of the Capitol.
That was a pretty
This is
well-constructed gallows, I have to say.
well-constructed. And remember, it kicks my mind, who planted a bomb? Why was there talk and chatter about a bomb? More than one. That didn't just happen all of a sudden. You heard Officer Hodges talk about that, Officer Dunn about the notion of even hearing that. They heard that and thought there is a bigger crowd gathering, not because they were afraid of being overwhelmed at that notion, because they were then potentially victims of it. And then think about how this entire hearing today began. That video, the end of the video, and they said, we should have more guns here next time.
30,000.
30,000. How foreboding. And that is why I say we don't yet know where this ends. We don't yet know whether the investigation will lead us to conclude that there are other instances that might be happening, whether the chatter has stopped. If I had subpoena power in the way of the DOJ, no stone would be left unturned, and the 500 plus people who happen to follow whatever orders is just a part of what I want to look at. I want to know, like Officer Dunn, who sent? Who was the hitman?
Who hired the hitman? And Chief Gaynor, let me ask you. We heard I think it was Daniel Hodges say that there was no doubt in his mind, it was one of the four officers, I'm pretty sure it was Hodges, say there was no doubt in his mind that the crowd would have kidnapped or killed members of Congress if given the opportunity. I'm told we have that soundbite. Let's run that.
What's worth all of that pain? What was worth it? What were you fighting for that day?
Democracy. You were 40 feet away, 40 yards, whatever. Especially with the razor thin margins on Democrats and Republicans in the House and Senate, if any single one person was kidnapped or killed, which I have no doubt in my mind is what they intended, that would affect the outcome of legislation and all your duties for years to come.
We also have seen, Chief Gaynor, video, closed circuit TV video of Senator Mitt Romney running for his life, being led by a police officer, I believe a Capitol police officer. Does it surprise you that more Republicans in the House and Senate, when they see Mitt Romney running for his life, when they hear a police officer saying that they were going to try to kill or kidnap members of Congress, when you hear the crowd chanting, "Hang Mike Pence," and we saw a video today of one of the insurrectionists picking up a phone and I guess performatively saying, "Mike Pence, we're coming for you, you traitor." Does it surprise you that more Republican office holders whose lives were at risk that day are not more, at least vocally, outraged?
Jake, I think it disappoints me more than surprises me. But as part of that, Officer Hodges was in one of the perfect positions of all the four that testify, because he was down on the ellipse and had some sense of what he saw in the crowd about people being armed and have vests and had the military look but were not police, and then ultimately being up at the Capitol. So he had a good sense of how this was developing, and he kind of leads to what are the next phases of this is going to be, what did we miss and how. When you get back to the members, on that day, they were just worried about themselves and perhaps their staff. And it was only later when they saw if they sided too much and were too honest in who were the insurrectionists, that they were going to affect their election, did they turn tail and just try to protect themselves and not offend former President Trump? So again, it says a lot about them and how weak they are when they have to decide which way they want to be, what oath of office is important to them, if any.
John King, one of the most telling events post January 6 was when former Vice President Mike Pence, who still harbors some presidential ambitions, I believe was in New Hampshire giving a speech, and he put a crack of daylight between him and then former President Trump, saying, "I don't think that the former president and I will ever see that day the same, that we'll ever see it the same way, the January 6th. You can't yada 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 hang Mike Pence. You know, I mean, the idea that this isn't like, oh, you know, we'll never agree on the ball going through Buckner's legs. No offense. It's about whether or not an angry mob that was chanting "Hang Mike Pence," that had a noose a few yards away, was actually going to do it. Donald Trump that day never called Mike Pence, never expressed any concern for Mike Pence or his family, and yet, again, yada, yada, yada.
Right. Look, you could ask this question both ways, which is Mike Pence, why doesn't Mike Pence walk away from Donald Trump? I think you answered it with the part of your question where he still has some presidential ambitions and he won't make the break completely.
They think he's a traitor.
Right. And in an interview with Carol Lunning and Phil Rucker of the Washington Post for their new book that's just out, that was conducted 4 months after the insurrection, Trump dumped all over Mike Pence again. Said if he runs again, he won't commit to him. Said how disappointed he is in Mike Pence. Mike Pence did his job. Mike Pence followed the Constitution. Mike Pence did his duty to the country. That he had no powers to do anything else. And yet Donald Trump to this day, and again, that gets you back to the bigger point. That is one piece of the many fictions, lies, falsehoods that Donald Trump continues to tell. It's another piece of this foundation of the big lie which brought those people to the Capitol. The committee can, go through, hopefully, to your point about how do you build this now, to the chief's point, who paid for the buses? Who sent the first email that was then spread to everybody, to the Proud Boys, to the haters, to the violent groups, the groups you are known to be violent, and to, you're right, thousands of people who may have come here because they believed the big lie, and some of them got caught up in something horrible. The digital footprint is now critical in this relationship. Mike Pence, from the Capitol, we know he called asking for the National Guard, saying, "I need it now." Well, what were the delays? Were they just normal delays? Sometimes bureaucracy happens. Or was the president of the White House saying no? That's the challenge for the committee now, and it's a daunting challenge. Even the current Attorney General has said he sees no executive privilege. The question is, we went through this in whether it was a big impeachment or just normal, traditional congressional oversight of the Trump administration. They just kept saying no, refusing to cooperate with even routine oversight. Will we now see the records? Will we see? And it's not just inside the White House. What about Rudy Giuliani? What about all these lawyers working with the president's political team?
Yeah.
They're in touch with these, forgive me, crazies around the country who want to continue to repeat the big lie. So I think the huge challenge today after the committee, I think just those officers, not the politicians, the officers made the case of why we need this committee. Now they have to do their work, and that's painstaking.
Just to add one thing, Donald Trump invited these people. He went on Twitter.
Yeah,
it was
repeatedly.
his staff and former staff got the permits for the rally, and then he went out and said, "Come."
And at the rally that day, he said, "We're going to go walk down Pennsylvania Avenue to the Capitol." He didn't actually walk, but he said, "Join me."
One other thing to add, the new chief of the Capitol Hill Police, Tom Manger, spoke to our Josh Campbell this week, and he told Josh, and Harry Dunn told me last night that the chief said the same thing to him. He said he's going to encourage other officers to speak out. There is very likely going to be more than just what we heard today.
Chief, let me ask you, where's the FOP? Where is the Fraternal Order of Police? Why are they not speaking out on behalf of these 4 officers?
That's a very good question. I have no idea. I really don't know. But I do know Tom Manger very, very well. From when he was Fairfax County Police Chief, Montgomery County, we worked together when I was in MPD, and then later with Major City Chiefs. They made a heck of a choice in Tom Manger. So he's going to turn that around, believe me. And that was one thing that they did, and they got right.
One thing that we haven't touched on yet is when Sergeant Aquilino Ganell, who's with the Capitol Police, was asked about Donald Trump's comments about the insurrectionists, that there was no hostility. I mean, it's just all part of this deranged lie about what happened January 6th. You've all seen the videotape since January 6th. You saw the videotape today. But Donald Trump describing it as hugs and kisses, describing it as the insurrectionists being affectionate to the men and women in blue who were literally being beaten by the crowd. Anyway, Officer Ganell, Sergeant Ganell with U.S. Capitol Police, was asked about that comment from Donald Trump today. Here was his reaction.
Is a pathetic excuse for his behavior for something that he himself helped to create, this monstrosity. I'm still recovering from those hugs and kisses that day that he claimed that so many rioters, terrorists, were assaulting us that day. If that was hugs and kisses, then we should all go to his house and do the same thing to him.
Later, Officer Ganell took back the part about going to Donald Trump's house, but the point still stands. They weren't hugs and kisses, and in fact, at a different time in the testimony, Officer Ganell said, "My fellow officers and I were punched, pushed, kicked, shoved, sprayed with chemical irritants, and even blinded with eye-damaging lasers by a violent mob." And he went on from there. Pretty shocking.
It is, and you mentioned the Fraternal Order of Police, but what about all the people who were very much against the protests related to the aftermath of the killing of George Floyd because they were seen as anti-police, who were villainizing those who were calling for accountability of police officers who did not honor their oath? He asked as well, where are all those people now to support these police officers, who some of whom, as Officer Fanone said, raised their hand that day when they saw their fellow police officers, men and women, overwhelmed and overrun, knowing full well that they were the last line of defense. You also don't see that, so the inconsistency is really so troubling to people. And remember, Officer Dunn at the end said that question, the word hero is thrown around all day today, and with good reason. These are heroes who were there. But he said, what is so heroic about telling the truth? The idea of having to investigate the truth. Why is that where we are right now in the heroism of that, or even confronting what we know to be true of what happened that day? And I think this investigation, this committee, this select committee that had the opportunity, as John pointed out, to be a bipartisan commission, they chose not to because only in Washington, D.C. do you not take yes for an answer.
Right.
You know, we still have all the information to try to uncover right now, but in terms of if you are saying that you are supportive of police officers, if you're saying that you do not support even the notion, although the messaging can be to be changed, of quote unquote reallocating funding or defunding aspects of it, well then shouldn't you have a vested interest in trying to ensure that these hearings actually happen, to fortify, to make sure that there's not issues about operational shortcomings or misgivings, that the officers have the resources that they need to address what is obviously the mental health issues that will result from this? Where are those vocal proponents of those now? And that is really, that silence is deafening these officers, and it decreases morale. And as a prosecutor, that is one of the most difficult things to then grapple with if you're talking about criminal prosecution. If you have police officers who lack the morale now to continue, to still serve, to still honor and abide by their oath, you don't have much of a justice system in the end.
Yeah, well, I mean, and one of the other things that's going on is you see House Republicans siding with the insurrectionists, and now Donald Trump is trying to turn one of the insurrectionists who was killed that day, Ashley Babbitt, into a martyr instead of somebody who was truly victimized by Donald Trump's big lie. Swept up in the insanity, swept up in the falsehoods, stormed the Capitol, got close to where she couldn't be, and there was a violent mob breaking down the doors to the Speaker's lobby, and unfortunately, law enforcement took her life. Thank you for joining our special coverage of the insurrection hearing The Centers for Disease Control is about to announce some new mask guidance today that includes guidance for vaccinated Americans. CNN's coverage continues with Allison Camerata and Victor Blackwell after this quick break. Thanks for joining us.